So good morning, grade 8 students. In this video, we're going to talk about digestion, part 3. I'm talking about the fit test. We said about the Fehling test. Fehling test is done to identify the presence of reducing sugars. All of them, they are considered as reducing except for sucrose. So procedure, we put the food in a test tube at equal volumes of Fehling A and Fehling B. This Fehling solution, it has a blue color. Heat the test tube over the Bunsen burner. So positive result, we have the brick red precipitate. This means that we have reducing sugar. And the negative result, there is no change in the color and it remains blue. This indicates the absence of reducing sugar. Iodine test is done to identify the presence of starch. So whenever we add the solution, as you look inside this pipette, this small pipette, it has brown orange in color. When it's added in cornstarch, it has the color of dark blue. So this indicates the presence of starch. While if the solution remains brown and orange in color, this indicates the absence of the starch with the iodine test. Biotest test, as we said before, it's done to test the presence of proteins and or polypeptides. So put a piece of food inside the test tube, add equal drops of what? Of the sodium hydroxide and the copper sulfate. Sodium hydroxide, it's CuSO4. This is the sodium hydroxide, copper sulfate CuSO4. Sodium hydroxide, it's NaOH. Okay, then the foreign mixture is called the biotest solution. It has a blue color. Then we move to the indications. If we have a violet color, what does this mean? This means that we have proteins and or polypeptides. While the negative result, the solution remains blue. This indicates the absence of proteins or polypeptides. So here we move to the coagulation test. Coagulation test, it's done to identify the presence of proteins and only proteins. So you have to heat the food till boiling. The positive result, the food coagulates here, the food shrinks like this in the case of the yuck. It shrinks, it coagulates, so we have proteins. If the food doesn't coagulate, so there is no protein, and this is a negative result. For example, you can ask your mom whenever you have a burger, so whenever you have to heat it to boiling, it becomes smaller in size. It coagulates. Why? Because it contains proteins. So in this test, Ali Basma, this will help you to find out if it contains proteins or polypeptides. So if we did the Bayer test and gives a positive result, meaning that we have proteins and or polypeptides, and we did the coagulation, so 100% it gives a positive result with the coagulation, so 100% it contains protein. So you have to know the difference. So Bayer test is for both proteins and or polypeptides. So we have positive with the biotech, so we have proteins or polypeptides or both of them. Whenever we did the coagulation and it gives a positive result, meaning that it contains proteins. Okay, this is for coagulation test. Now we're going to move to the next test, which is the translucent spot test. Translucent spot test is done to identify the presence of lipids. This test is very easy. You have to rub a piece of food against a paper. For example, I have a butter. You can rub it using a paper. And we can observe it under the sunlight as shown in this figure. This mostly happens with you whenever you are eating manusha, za'atar, mainly because it contains a lot of oil. So whenever you eat this paper will be containing like these spots. These spots, they are translucent spot. So translucent spot test is done to identify the presence of lipids. So whenever you look with the paper on the sunlight, you are able to see the sunlight and the sunlight can pass through it. So this is a translucent spot test. Whenever you have this, so this means that you have lipids. While negative result, there is no translucent spot, meaning that there is no lipid. So I will repeat it, translucent test, or you can say translucent spot test It's done to identify the presence of lipids. So you have to rub a piece of food. You have to rub it, for example, I bring a butter yesterday, I rub it using a paper and I observe it under the sunlight. If I have, for example, the translucent spot, this means that it's a positive result and we have lipids. Why? If there is no translucent spot, so this is a negative result and we don't have lipids. Second test, it's done for lipids. It's called the Sodan test and not Sodan test. It's called Sodan test. Sodan test is done to identify the presence of lipids also. Simple procedure. Add Sodan test solution to the food. So you add few drops of Sodan test solution. If we have a positive result, so we have pink color, like this figure. So pink color appears. Whenever we have the pink color, this means that we have lipids. While whenever we don't have the pink color, no pink color, so there is no lipid. Okay? No lipids. So here, the positive result and the negative result of the Zoden test. So we have two tests for the lipids. Soden test, it's very simple. Add Soden test solution. If the color becomes pink, so we have lipids. There is no pink color, no lipids. The second test for lipids is called the translucent spot test. So translucent spot test is done to identify the presence of lipids also. So you have to rub a piece of food against a paper, observe it under the sunlight. If we have translucent spot, so this is a positive result. And if there is no translucent spot, and this is a negative result. Also, let's move to the coagulation test. I'm going to make a revision. So coagulation test is done to identify the presence of proteins and only proteins. So what's the difference between these two, Biret test and the translucent? Biret for proteins and or polypeptides. So both of them. But to make sure that we have proteins, we have to do the coagulation test. So coagulation, it will confirm 100% that we have proteins. Or if it's a negative with the coagulation, so it contains polypeptide. So if we did Biret and the coagulation, Biret will say that we have proteins and or polypeptides. But if we did the coagulation, it will confirm about protein. So if it gives a positive result, let's say positive with the Biret, okay? Biret, it gives a positive. And also it gives a positive with the coagulation. So here, coagulation test is positive. So if it gives positive with Biret test, so we have proteins and slash or polypeptides. And slash or polypeptides. But here, if it's positive with the coagulation, so 100% it contains proteins. So here, this food contains proteins. Okay, because this one is, let's say, it's confusing. Maybe protein, maybe polypeptide, maybe both. But if we did coagulation, it gives 100% protein, so it contains proteins. And moving back to the uh, iodine test is done for the starch. So if you have darky blue color, so this is a positive result, and here we have the starch. It's a negative brown orange, and this means that we have no starch. And the first test was the pairing test is done to identify the presence of reducing sugar, and you have to know if you have brick red precipitate, this indicates the presence of reducing sugar, while if there is no brick red precipitate and we have only blue color like the phenolic solution, so this indicates the absence of reducing sugar. These are the different tests. So I repeat, phenolic test for reducing sugar, iodine test for the starch, Biuret test for proteins and slash or polypeptides, coagulation for proteins only, and we have two tests for lipids that are the translucent test or translucent spot test, and the final test which is the Soden test. So we have six different tests these 6, 7 tests, you have to study them, you have to study the procedure, and you have to study the negative result and the positive result. So whenever we did any test, you have to know what is the positive result, meaning that if it makes positive with valine, so it contains reduced sugar. If it's positive with pyrite, it contains proteins and or polypeptides, and so on. So this is everything for our session for today.